Hello, and thank you for joining me today to talk about the IS curve and the ISMP model. First, let's break down what the IS curve represents, which is the goods market equilibrium. Now, when it comes to economics and the market for goods and services, we always seem to like our equilibriums. And in this case, it's where total spending is equal to the total supply of goods to the economy. Total spending is also known as the aggregate expenditure, which is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. While total supply is the total value of goods produced, which is GDP, and is shown as Y. It is important to note that consumption is not related to the real GDP and is instead known as autonomous consumption, that is unrelated to income. Now we shall take a gander at what changing inventories or unplanned aggregate expenditure does to the IS curve. Let's begin by constructing the graph with the planned aggregate expenditure on the y-axis and the output on the x-axis. Then we have the 45-degree line known as the Keynesian cross, where the aggregate expenditure is equal to the real GDP. Now add the aggregate expenditure line that is comprised of that consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. That gives us the equilibrium of the goods market, where the aggregate expenditure line meets the 45-degree line. Now, movements along this curve caused by inventory changes will adjust via the amount of output and employment to always return back to equilibrium. So if we have inventories increase and there is a movement along the curve to the right, then output will decrease, decreasing the inventories and employment along with it to bring it back to equilibrium. And in the other direction, with inventories being less than what was needed, causing output to increase, increasing inventories and the employment rate, bringing it back to perfect equilibrium. Now let's take a look at what causes the IS curve to shift. It is important to note that anything that causes a change in the real interest rate will instead be a movement along the IS curve and not a shift. Okay, so shocks. Shocks are the shifters. Positive demand shocks, such as household taxes, decreases, or subsidies given to investors, will move the curve up, and along with it, an increase in the GDP. Whereas the negative shocks, say because the expectations for consumers and investors instead plummets or taxes begin to rise exponentially, will move the curve down, and with it, a decrease in the GDP. Now let's look at how the shifts in the IS curve create output gaps. So if we instead consider aggregate expenditure in terms of the real interest rate and the output, or real GDP, we get a downward sloping line. And in the middle, we see a vertical line representing where real GDP is equal to the potential GDP. Now, if we have one of those positive demand shocks that cause the aggregate expenditure line to shift right, it results in a positive output gap, where the real GDP is greater than the potential. If we instead have a negative demand shock and the curve shifts left, then we have a negative output gap where the real GDP is less than the potential GDP. In order for it to be a shift along the curve and not a movement, as mentioned earlier, real interest rate will be staying constant the entire time. That's all. Thank you for watching and hope you have a lovely day.